Chapter 1: The Advancing Motivation. We all have an intuitive understanding that all personal activity and behavior is guided, directed, and fueled by some motive or set of motivations. For some reason, many have been taught to believe it is wrong to admit that all actions, including all of their actions, are backed by motives. There is nothing inherently wrong with this fact, and it is important that we vindicate the idea that motive forces or motivations are by nature something worth stigmatization and or criminalization. Motivation in its most abstract sense, and as a phenomena, is normal in all of life. What deserves interpretation is the character of the motivation and not the mere existence of motivation. The objective of this chapter is to learn to discern and distinguish two general types of motivation that are in operation in all persons at any given time. It must be stated that it is not in our interest to promote or promulgate that one form of motivation should be followed to the absolute exclusion of the other, for the total absence of one form would result in a partial and incomplete disposition. In fact, it may be said that due to the nature of behavioral motivation, it is impossible to totally exclude any one type at all, for motivation is dynamic and not monostatic in nature. Know that both of the modalities to be discussed are respectively different yet equally valuable if understood in their proper priority, order, and relation to one another. The endeavor here is to clearly organize the two general motivational archetypes into a proper relation and arrangement to one another, specifically in a way which is best suited for long-term personal advancement. It should be acknowledged that an individual's predominant archetype of motivation is what will determine whether or not the individual has a sustainable attitude towards any particular advancement. The following paragraphs will make this very clear. In the general common society, those who fail to advance towards their ideal can be found to possess a tendency to excuse themselves by claiming a lack of motivation. Yet, upon deeper inspection, we will typically discover that it is never that motivations are non-existent, for that can never occur. What we will see is that the motivational archetype one is operating from is simply not suitable for long-term advancement toward their ideal. In general, most people tend to have motivations that wane and which are ephemeral, meaning, in general, people tend to be swayed by a type of motivation which at its first kindling of tinder was destined to exhaust its energy reserves before the desire is fulfilled. The type of motivation which is most ephemeral is what is formally known as extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation can be simply defined as externally driven motivation. People who have extrinsic motivations are primarily motivated by external praise, approval, rewards, acquisitions, satisfactions that can only be compensated for from without. That is to say, something which can be given to them, thus wholly predicated upon, and which necessitates their external world. In brief, extrinsic motivation is based on externally received rewards. Most people who are extrinsically motivated tend to lose steam very quickly. Have you ever wondered why that is? Let us use the maintenance and or improvement of one's personal physical health as an example. More often than not, in instances such as these, we find a high degree of motivation at the onset of the undertaking, soon followed by many losing motivation or their initial drive not long after. What do you suppose is the reason for this sporadic tendency? It may be said that loss of motivation is partially due to the unspoken fact that the individual did not initially set out to advance themselves for themselves, and that they acted not to improve themselves as their primary intention, but instead in order to acquire the appraisal and esteem in the eyes of others. That is to say, seeking an external reward. You will understand why we can infer this in the coming paragraphs. Extrinsic motivation as a catalyst to behavior is not only limited to preferable rewards and positively connoted accomplishments. Extrinsic motivation also manifests in those who are inversely motivated, meaning negatively spurred to action by potential punishment, penalty, or unfavorable circumstance. An example of this can be seen in the cases of those who only take action when they are seeking to avoid punitive circumstances, whereby which, if or when they do not act, they will suffer in ways they wish not to. These types of people are those only who wake up early or on time in order so that they may save their place at their job, yet seldom, if ever, to advance themselves. Another example can be observed in those who settle for mediocre grades to avoid being left behind, and in those who, instead of aiming to be exceptional for the merit of excellence, settle for passing to avoid total failure. We may also see negative extrinsic motivation manifested in those who show up merely to be present in order to avoid the penalty which would incur if they did not show up. Yet, even though they do show up, these individuals do not perform above minimum standards which are expected. The inverse manifestation of extrinsic motivation may be seen in the individual who financially earns enough money so that they do not end up homeless, hungry, or barren. What we see here is that the negative or inverse manifestation of extrinsic motivation can also be observed in those who have learned to only react and act based on avoiding punishment, and not only in those who are aiming to receive a reward. It is sensible enough that avoiding negative or undesirable consequences is in everyone's best interest. But the nuance of the inverse extrinsic motivation is that the individual is spurred to action only in the case of an impending penalty or punitive consequence. Suppose these types know that there is no negative event or a looming penalty on the horizon, meaning that if they know they do not have to perform a task and that there is a great deal of time to spend in other ways, it is very likely that these extrinsically motivated people will procrastinate until the very last moment. This type of attitude is not ideal by any means for long-term advancement. When it comes to long-term undertakings, external motivation and force is the most liable and apt to fail. Now on to the next type of motivation, which is intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation, in the most simplistic sense, is the type of motivation based on one's own internally engineered rewards, satisfactions, and directions. Formally defined, intrinsic motivation is the doing of an activity for its inherent satisfactions rather than for some separable consequence or external pressure. The intrinsically motivated individual is motivated and spurred to action for themselves by themselves, for challenge and growth rather than by external gratifications, pressures, or rewards. We may say that the main difference between the two motivational dispositions is that extrinsic motivation is a force or compulsion from without, while intrinsic motivation is characterized by a pressure or compulsion from within. Extrinsic motivation moves from surface to core. Intrinsic motivation emerges from core to the surface. The key in developing the sustainable advancing attitude will not be found by ridding oneself of one or the other, meaning the key will not be in developing an attitude of absolutism towards one form of motivation or another. Instead, the essential lesson is to truly begin creating and establishing a hierarchy or an order of importance between the two motivational modalities. We see very often that those who operate from an externally fixed reward center and extrinsic motivation tend to burn out because inherently humans do not care much in the long view for the esteem of others. Yet subconsciously, what is most important and yet outwardly undervalued is our own esteem and opinion of ourselves. So, we may be motivated to good health, but it must be intrinsically so and not extrinsic. The same principle applies to wealth and the entire spectrum of possible achievements and rewards. Although many fail to recognize the following truth, in the last analysis, it is universally law and observable in all of existence that the most everlasting creative power is always from within to without. By having externally centered motivations as a starting point for actions or behavior, the individual will lack the essential compelling force that will sustainably launch and shuttle them towards an advancing life. In short, we may conclude that the advancing individual with the advancing attitude may have external goals, but the advancing individual has intrinsic motivation which is fixed internally, operating from within to without, internally directed towards external factors. The advancing individual with the advancing attitude that is most sustainable is internally directed towards making themselves better for themselves by themselves, instead of making themselves appear better for others. Although others may very well find the achievements of an intrinsically motivated individual praiseworthy. Suppose we simulate a scenario where we observe two individuals, one primarily externally motivated or extrinsically motivated, and the other primarily internally directed or intrinsically motivated. Let us assume both of these individuals are living in a contemporary Western society as normal. We begin by removing the two individuals from this modern world and placing them in solitude, perhaps a forest. It should be elementary to predict how each of the two are most likely to fare and adapt to these new circumstances. Who of the two do you suppose is more likely to suffer internal states of confusion, angst, or aimlessness? The externally extrinsically oriented individual would be the first to qualify, would they not? This is not to say that the externally motivated individual will always, absolutely, and most certainly fall apart, for this may be the set of conditions that bring forth latent powers, hitherto undeveloped and untapped, into externalization. Still, we may agree that the internally directed, intrinsically motivated individual possesses a higher probability of becoming well adjusted to this new scenario and solitude. We may infer and agree that the likelihood of the intrinsic individual staying actively motivated, avoiding the episodes of helplessness, despondency, or apathy typically observed in those who lack internal motivation, is way higher than the individual who up until now has only displayed a steep inclination and reliance upon external pressures, esteems, opinions, rewards, and satisfactions to initiate themselves to action. Again, this is not a 100% absolute, as for in statistics, it is tacitly understood by any amateur that there are no absolutes. But by means of our common sense and the general tendencies evident about us, we may infer that the probability of the externally motivated individual to suffer more negative durations of time and experience is very high, while the internally directed individual would find a less psychologically difficult time adjusting to the solitude and their new environment. So, you must understand, as it pertains to the dispositions of motivation, the advancing individual has their motivational axis primarily intrinsically fixed. What this means is the advancing individual is internally directed and can guide themselves based on deep, measurable personal satisfaction, embracing challenges, stretching themselves, developing themselves, and improving themselves for themselves. This is the personal quality found least but needed most in general society. These are the set of characteristics that those who are constantly escaped by the advancement they desire ultimately need to cultivate. It is this faculty of internal direction, self-exploration, curiosity, and the testing of oneself which bears the greatest benefit to oneself. It is the insistent challenging of oneself, despite whether or not others are involved, that is most potent and impactful in manifesting lasting satisfaction and achievement throughout life. It is the inner satisfaction one derives from evolving. Both the perpetual adaptation and ceaseless increasing of one's personal competence are the master qualities found in the advancing individual. Simply think of children and their tendencies. There is the rare child who plays and remains innovatively active to their own satisfaction, whether or not anyone is present, while there are many other children who are always looking to gain satisfaction or begin activity only when external factors such as people, rewards, or punishments are involved. And if these external factors are not present, these externally oriented persons will more often than not profess they are bored. This is not to say that the advancing individual, who is intrinsically motivated, would prefer to starve and be without the luxuries of life, be isolated without social networks, deprived of the beautiful things of life, and all other enjoyable facets of living. Quite the opposite. Again, it is very well impossible to have one form of motivation to the total and absolute exclusion of the other. The important understanding to take away is the importance of setting our orders of operation in such a way that will sustain long term effective efforts toward advancement. Now that you are aware of the distinguishing traits which contrast the two types of motivations expressed by individuals, you will see that those who are primarily intrinsically and internally directed will always be more inclined to taking action because they are moved from within, while extrinsically motivated individuals or those who wait or depend on external factors, pressures, rewards, and compensation to take action will seldom get as far. Why? It is because one is the source of their own inspiration, while the other must be acted upon from an outside force in order to move, similar to a ball which, if not kicked, will remain in its place indefinitely. The true distinction has root in the order, priority, and hierarchy from which the motivation stems, the axis by which motivation is fixed. Quote, "From whence do the winds of your sails have their origin?" Sheikhy Chic. End quote. Know that if you are to consider yourself an advancing individual, it is imperative that you begin to center yourself and develop intrinsic motivations as your axis priori. Whether or not one sees you doing the things you do, whether or not one appraises you for the things that you do you do them? Will you do them? Are you advancing for advancing's sake and the benefits advancing itself brings into your life? Or are you advancing for the appraisal of others? Ask yourself, if no one was around, would you still be able to spur yourself towards the activities that you publicly profess you do for the love of the activity? If not, what would you be doing? Let us revisit one of the most widely applicable scenarios by asking the following question. Would you still train and exercise your body if no one was able to see and appraise the externalized effect? Do you exercise and train your body because of the intrinsic benefits towards your well-being, which are you being stronger, more capable, and more able? Or is it that you exercise in an effort to seek appraisal from others? What do you find yourself doing when you are in leisure these days? Do you drift? Are you bored often? If so, it is advised that you inspect and reflect on your motives. Those who begin with external appraisals in mind seldom achieve the deep satisfaction sought in all of humanity. Those who begin with self-improvement in mind tend to trend to the very end. Every individual must search their own soul for the truth of their motivations. But it is very wise for one who finds that they have been extrinsically motivated up until this point to begin at once discovering the true value that comes by cultivating the love and satisfaction for advancement in and of itself. You must begin to truly enjoy not the reward, but the process, for the rewards are always inevitable when one's intention and trajectory begin in the right place. The process is the reward. The process is where you are advancing. The end result is the testament to your advancement. This switch in perspective will solve the problem of waning motivation and dissolution found in the majority. Know that praise may come or praise may not come, yet it is likely to come in a world full of people who fail to undertake and see through any form of remarkable personal advancement. Still, do not worry or concern yourself with these petty matters. You are now the advancing individual who realizes the deep satisfaction that comes from becoming a higher, more integrated, effective, and efficient version of yourself. Learning to accomplish more of what you idealize in the same span of time without wasting more than ever before, by thinking more clearly than ever before. You will learn to love the feeling of progress in and of itself, and not simply the rewards which are absolutely inevitable when our intentions and order of priority are set in their proper relations. Most simply fail to accomplish when their hierarchy of motivations are not in the correct order. The intrinsically, internally, self-directed advancing person will always have the leading edge because it is the pure joy of advancement. It is the pure joy of being and becoming more than one has ever been before. That is to say, the evolutionary principle, which is forever active, that the advancing individuals of life are spurred by. The joy of advancement from within is the eternal oil which will light your way, exhaustless and infinite. Like the child who has learned to enjoy themselves by themselves, the advanced motivational disposition requires no eyes, no audience, no compensation, other than the stretching of one's individuality and personal being into higher planes of activity, and thus life. Again, every individual must search their own soul and put their motivations in the correct order if they ever wish to establish successful harmony with themselves, their environment, and their goals. Advancing, knowing that once harmony is achieved, that the advancing individual will achieve what eludes many for lifetimes and eons. Quote, what are your incentives? What are your perverse incentives? Know them and know them very well. Sheikhy Chic, end quote.